It's the advance toward an alternative form, not restricted to industry. And that's what we're calling the knowledge economy in this conversation. Now, China doesn't simply buy things from us. China increasingly also invests in Brazil. But the vast majority of Chinese investments in Brazil are either investments in physical infrastructure designed to facilitate the export of our commodities, or they are outposts of belated Fordist mass production. So, for example, the steel mills are not advanced mini mills in the post-Fordist style. They're the traditional production of basic steel. So that's a situation that exists now. And so one dimension is how do we change that? And how can we develop a strategic alliance in the creation of this alternative economic future? China is also faced with the task of moving from being a low-wage, low-productivity economy to being a high-wage, high-productivity economy. We note with great interest that the Chinese leadership, including in the recent 19th Congress, signifies its emphasis on the transformation of the economy on the supply side. But the supply side transformation of the economy is a concept that has no self-evident content. One way of interpreting it is to interpret it as the attempt to find a solution to the dilemma that I just described. That the traditional route to growth, conventional industrialization, is blocked, and the alternative of the inclusive knowledge economy seems to be inaccessible. That's what we need to do. And it's not as if there existed a blueprint showing us how to do it. No one knows how to do it. So in our countries, we would have to find a way, either separately or together. And that then would bring us to the second dimension of our collaboration, which maybe has special pertinence to our conversation here in the State Council, which is the formation of the ideas. We can't do this without ideas. And it's not as if the ideas existed ready-made in books. So the question is how we could work to develop these ideas together in some form.
简单的翻译一下，它就是现在进入它的第三个阶段。那么，它就是在巴西是有一个观点，就是从表象至少看到，就是有一种和中国的经济关系好像有一种类似于新殖民主义的状态，因为中国在巴西的投资，要不然就是在一些基础设施的投资，这基础设施投资它是有，他们觉得就是有利于就是向中国出口产品，比如说离那个港口可以更近，比如修条铁路离港口更近了，到出口中。那么另外一种就是说把传统的福特主义的一些生产，就是进一步搬到巴西，比如说巴西的钢厂，它不是最先进的后福特主义的 mini mill， 就是那个小钢厂，它是不是传统的那种做 mini mill 是一种最先进的后福特主义制造，它是把那个大家可能都知道这个意思，它这个 mini mill 是一种和那个传统的流程是不一样的。那么，但是中国的巴西公司也不是这种性质，还是传统的福特主义钢厂。那么，所以巴西的新一届的政府会想，就是怎么改变这样一种局面。那么，这个局面它是不是应该和中国一起来，就是在中国巴西能够探索共同的怎么打破？他认为中国也面临着完全按传统的福特主义工业化，实际上也走不通的这样的情况。所以，怎么能够共同的来创造一种新的局面？他说这是需要新的思想的。 他说也许就是国务院发展中心这个讨论就是特别重要，就是可能带来新的思想。所以现在可以就讨论一下事情。
As to next stage of China-Brazil cooperation, and definitely, I think I think that's an issue that to be that has to be addressed on both sides. You mentioned that China's investment in Brazil at this moment is trying to facilitate the export of commodity goods to China. I think economically it's rational, and should there be very competitive and other manufactured goods potentially to import from Brazil, I think China will do that as well. As your mentioning of Chinese investment in Brazil just to copy the mega factories built in China to just copy it in Brazil. I don't know how to explain this, but I can explain how we have achieved, how we arrived here today. Because at the very beginning, when China opened its investment market to the outside world, we welcome that kind of investment because that has actually speeded up China's industrialization. I saw with my own eyes in cities in the coast area like in Guangdong, you have mega factory with hundreds of tens of thousands of young girls just making goods like the fiber optic components because it requires the sharp eyesight of the young people. So we experienced that kind of yeah.
But so let me just make two clarifications. So the first clarification is I'm not suggesting that we should cease to produce and export commodities. Although, of course, even natural products can go up a chain of aggregation of value. One thing is to take advantage of the resources of nature as an alternative, a substitute for advanced production. And the other thing is to use our comparative advantage in these natural products to help finance and encourage the development of the advanced practice of production. So I'm not making an argument against agriculture or against mining. The question is the structural relation between this focus on the natural products and the qualitative transformation of the profile of production and export in Brazil. That's the question. Now, with regard to your second remark about the advantages of beginning with Fordist mass production, we already began with Fordist mass production 100 years ago. That's what we have in Brazil. And it's not as if we're in the situation of an African country deciding what to do next. We've undergone a long history of industrialization. And we're not a country that is viable on the basis of very low wage labor, as some of the Southeast Asian countries, for example, might be. So we can't simply return to this model of 100 years ago or 70 years ago. It's not feasible. That is, it's not a feasible message to the country to say that the whole of Brazil should become the São Paulo of the 1940s in order later to become something else. That's not practical, and it's not acceptable. So that's a basic circumstance of our situation.
I understand that and agree with you, especially that the level of development in Brazil is still ahead of us, I mean, in terms of per capita GDP. But I would like to share with you a story about how we one single factory has moved in the 3 days time from pro-folding factory to post-folding factory. That's a factory known as Biadi. I mean, that company started with manufacturing lithium battery. And the barrier for investment was arranged very high.
Yes.
Yeah. What Biadi did is just to break the production process apart, replace machines with neighbors, and that reduced the total cost of products.
Yes.
And then help the company to and to enter into the very competitive market. Yeah. And then since the skills accumulated, capital accumulated, they replace the labor with machines. Now they are trying to replace labor with say robots. So yeah.
So of course this conversation is very general and very abstract, but I want to argue that the attempt to make the inaccessible accessible, to find steps by which to get to there from here, has a very particular content. So let me just give 2 sets of examples. So first there are the institutional examples. There's no ready-made blueprint to which we can conform. We have to discover how to do this. And we need the appropriate institutional architecture. You know, there are 2 main types of government-business relations available in the world. There's the American model of arm's length regulation of business by government. And there's the Northeast Asian model of formulation of a unitary trade and industrial policy imposed top-down by the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. We would need a third model, a form of strategic coordination that is decentralized, pluralistic, participatory, and experimental, working through a set of organizations that are intermediate between the state and the firms. So let's say that's the vertical axis of this institutional architecture. Then the horizontal axis has to do with the relations among firms. It seems that we need to organize and encourage practices of cooperative competition so that these innovative firms, while continuing to compete against one another, can also pool resources and achieve economies of scale. What we're doing there is renovating the institutional and legal machinery of the market economy. We're not just regulating the market. And that's a bold task. Now, let me give the second example. The second example is education. Both general education and technical education. In what educational setting can an inclusive form of the knowledge economy prosper? It can't be encyclopedic, information-oriented education. It has to be a form of education that prioritizes analytic and synthetic capabilities, that with respect to content prefers selective depth to encyclopedic coverage, that organizes teaching and learning cooperatively, and that presents every discipline dialectically through opposing points of view. And the mode of technical education can't be the old German model of teaching job-specific and machine-specific skills. It has to focus on meta-capacities, on higher-order, generic, conceptual, and practical capabilities, like the capabilities required for the use of numerically controlled machine tools. So, by giving these institutional and educational examples, what I want to suggest is that this project has a certain content that has to be developed. It's not vacuous. So the idea of transforming the economy on the supply side is just an abstraction. But we can begin to give content to this abstraction. And then we can begin to work on something tangible. either separately or together. That's the focus of the conversation. Yeah.
OK， 我简单传一下。他说开始说呢，就是回应市集的问题的时候，他说他想做2个澄清。一个澄清就是说，他并不是主张说巴西就停止初级产品出口了，还关键是说你这个初级产品的出口的收益用来干什么？你是用来那个是不是升级换代进入到这个新的知识经济，还是干别的？所以，那么第二点他就说呢，巴西不是那个非洲国家，实际上那个大规模的扶持主义生产在20世纪40年代以来就一直都已经做了，所以那个如果现在在巴西说我们还要就是说再回到圣保罗的1940年代，然后以后再那个他觉得这个是，比如说在明年的选举当中，就这个肯定不是一个能够获胜的口号。那么刚才世吉我理解，如果理解你问题对的话，就是世吉回答他说他理解这一点。他举了例子，比亚迪开始他觉得劳动成本太高了，机器成本太高，他都换成人，他换成人以后，生产上去了以后呢，他现在又换成机器人，是不是这意思？就是所以他就说和那个他这个和Unger是
30年就从前古的时代走到后古的
对
时代。
对，但是这里面他就有一个退一步又进2步这意思是吧？你是这个意思，退一步进2步这样。那么他就这样和就是所以你这和他的也不矛盾，他的意思。那么但Unger意思就是说，他实际就主张这个供给侧改革就是这种进入到新的知识经济，实际上是一个供给侧改革。但是它这供给侧改革的内容，这个 content of supply reform 呢，其实是需要进一步给它说清楚，以共同来研究的这供给侧改革。所以它包括它一个横轴，一个竖轴。它这个竖轴就是包括企业和国家的关系，就是现在流行的2种，一种像美国式，就是国家和企业之间其实就是没有太多的合作关系，它是一个 arm's length 国家。另外就是说东北亚国家，但是后面的国家有比较权威主义，就是国家就是对企业的那个指导什么的，就好像又太但是这2种美国和东北亚，他认为在这2种之外，应该有多种形式在这个纵轴方面，国家和企业之间的多种形式的分散化的实验主义的合作的关系，就国家和企业。另外的横轴上就企业之间的关系。也应该有很多新的创新，包括这个既合作又竞争的这种，他认为这都是使供给侧结构改革的内容所应该讨论的。
So I wonder whether we should go on then to the 4th set of comments about the world order, about global governance. So let me begin with a general remark. Any emerging power always confronts an ambiguity or an ambivalence between 2 impulses with respect to the established organization of the world. On the other hand, it may seek to achieve a better place within the established world order. On the other hand, it may seek to struggle together with other countries to change the established world order. It may exercise its revisionary power. And in every historical circumstance, there will be some division, some contradiction, some coexistence between these 2 impulses, to prosper within the existing order or to struggle to change the order. But I think it's fair to say that both China and Brazil have decisively preferred the first impulse to the second. They have basically focused on achieving the best position within the established order rather than on working to change the order. And this is a problem. This is a problem because the established arrangements of the world order inhibit the institutional experiments that we need to solve our problems and to implement the task of developing an inclusive form of what I was calling the knowledge economy. Let me give you the example of the world trade regime that is evolving under the WTO treaties and under the major proposed regional trade pacts, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership or the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This world trade regime is characterized by what you could describe as an institutional maximalism. It requires not simply adherence to the market economy in the abstract, but also the acceptance of a very particular version of the market economy. It is, for example, a version of the market economy that wants to prohibit, under the label subsidies, all the forms of strategic coordination between governments and firms that the countries that are now rich used in order to become rich. What we should desire from the standpoint of our interests is an institutional minimalism in the world trade regime. That is to say, the maximum of economic openness with the minimum of restraint on the institutional experiments that we need to establish these alternative strategies of national development. Now, we know that this institutional minimalism is possible because it in fact characterized the predecessor to the WTO, the regime of the GATT. So maybe you should translate.
他说的现在第4个阶段讨论就是关于这国际体制的这个治理体系的改革的问题。他认为就是有2种态度对目前的国际体系，一种就是说在目前的国际体系之内寻求一个比较好的位置，改善这个目前的位置；另外一种就是改变这个国际体系。那么他认为中国和巴西都有，基本上是在前一种，就是在目前的国际体系下争取自己一个更好的位置。但他认为他实际上是认为，就中国和巴西应该共同努力进一步改变这个国际体系，而不是在目前的体系下做好这。他举一个例子，就是比如说 WTO 用那个反补贴，用反补贴这种原则呢，把很多其实发展中国家需要的，就是政府和企业间的那个战略合作，有很多种形式，但作为 WTO 的反补贴，它都不允许的。那么实际上，他认为中国、巴西应该共同的改变这种国际体制。那么他认为这个国际贸易体系下，发展中国家应该寻求一种叫 institutional minimalism， 就是说制度最小主义。什么意思？就是说，就是那个国际贸易体系所要求每个国家内部的那个体系对它那个要求制度要求应该最小，而现在是最大的。就是实际上是现在国际贸易体系对每个国家内部的要求，它就是 institutional maximalism。那么他认为这个实际上是就是我们需要共同改变这样的一个体系。
So you will forgive me for mentioning some aspects of my personal experience in order to make my point. When I was in the Lula government, I represented Brazil in several of the BRICS meetings, early in the history of the BRICS movement.
当他是在卢拉政府担任战略事务部长的时候，他代表巴西政府参加了金砖5国的几次会谈。
China in these meetings was represented by State Councilor Dai Bingua, who was supposedly my counterpart in the Chinese state. And I made a series of proposals in the spirit of exercising what I call this revisionary power. Instead of just trying to compete for a better place in the established order, working together in the direction of changing the order.
就是他在和代表国务委员的会谈当中多次提出，就是我们。
So I'll give you. So I'll give you 3 examples. Some of them very general, and others much more specific. So I tried to press the question of initiatives that we could take gradually to get rid of the United States dollar as the international reserve currency. And I suggested that we begin with bilateral currency relations so that we could deal with one another circumventing the dollar. And that would be an intermediate step in the direction of dispensing with the dollar altogether. if the monetary arrangements of the world are controlled by the United States Treasury, there is obviously a powerful inhibition to these strong national alternatives. My experience is that the representatives of China and of India were somewhat frightened by these proposals and regarded them as excessively radical at that time. China had practical reasons for ambivalence, as for example the protection of its own reserves in US dollars, that it seemed to fear would be devalued by this incendiary talk.
这是which year was this talk?
This was in 2008.
他说2008年就是和代表国务员那个会谈的时候，他就提出就是中巴贸易之间怎么就是通过结算方式避免用美元来结算。那么当时这个金砖会谈当中，他觉得中国和巴西当时2008年的时候还不积极，那个时候因为他觉得中国他可以理解，因为中国本身那个美元的储备太多，如果美元如果有什么贬值的话，可能中国本身有束缚，但是他觉得从长期来看，应该共同努力逐步的取代美元的这个国际地位。
Now, the second example was then the attempt to get us in the debate about the reformation of the world trade regime in the direction that I just described, toward minimalism rather than maximalism. Resistance to the prohibition of so-called subsidies, resistance to the incorporation into the world trade regimes of the present rules of intellectual property. And once again, I encountered on the part of the Chinese and Indian representatives ambivalence or reluctance. Russia was always willing to consider any radical proposal and was in the position that Shakespeare describes as that of King Lear. I shall do such things, I know not what.
他说那个就是2008年的时候，他也是就是在那个国际贸易体系上，他也建议在这金砖五国会谈当中建议这个。
Now,
我还没分享，打破这个，就是说用反补贴的名义，把很多战略和国家和企业之间战略合作都给排除在外。这样他实际上刚才我忘了翻译的前面跟我说，他认为在 WTO 之前的 GATT 里面，实际上各个国家的创新的尺度空间更大。那就 GATT 他觉得其实比 WTO 在这方面要好。 那么他说那个中国和巴西的那个会谈到2008年的时候也还是不积极对他这个建议，但是俄罗斯是很支持，但俄罗斯支持就像莎士比亚 King Lear 里边说，就是说我非常愿意，但是我不知道to do what， 他不知道他怎么做，但是他很愿意做。
Now, the third example is this. I propose that the BRICS establish a bank, the BRICS Bank. And my idea of the bank was that the bank would not simply be to do what banks ordinarily do, which is to finance any short-term project, but to finance strategic initiatives that exemplify the alternative strategy of development for which we're looking. Now, subsequently, the bank was created and established in Shanghai, but it's nothing like the bank I proposed. So its main activity is to fund infrastructure investment, to do stuff like taking soy and iron ore out of Brazil.
就是说第三个建议就是建立一个金砖国家银行，这个建议他说倒是被接受，在上海成立了，但是它的具体那个内容又和他的建议不一样，就是说，因为他的建议是说，这个新的银行应该做那种战略性的投资，代表着新的发展方向的，但是现在还基本是做一些基础设施投资。
So what's the lesson that I infer from this sobering experience? It's that the proposals I made were premature. They were premature because we can't have a strong revisionary project with respect to the global order unless we first have a strong internal project for the reorientation of our strategy of development. The external project, the revision of the world order, is simply an extension or an expression of the internal project. But to the extent that we do have an internal project, we need to complement it with a strong external project. And then all of these proposals and many other proposals like them would come to life.
他说他现在回想起来，就2008年那个金砖谈判的时候，他那些建议他觉得还是不成熟的。为什么呢？他主要是说，因为每个国家内部还没有一个替代性的改革方案。他说，只有在每个国家内部都有一个新的改革方案以后，这个改变国际秩序那些建议才有可能就是真正被接受。
So that's all I wanted to say by way of provoking conversation.
这是他全部这就结束了，对他想说的。其实现在就希望再有些讨论，就是。
I come to, I'll respond to your second dimension of cooperation and the third issue raised. I absolutely in favor of both cooperation ideas. And then should we had that kind of cooperation ideas first, and then probably your proposals to the BRICS will not look like that radical anyway. So thanks for the proposing for very important issues for discussion. Before I think we go further into those issues, I would like to raise an issue which is very important to us, for us to understand what's been going on in Brazil and in other Latin American countries. And over the past few years, we have a lot of discussions among ourselves about the middle-income trap, the so-called middle-income trap. That is something I think looks increasingly more likely and a real problem for many developing countries. We have people saying that from the experience of South American countries, including in Brazil, the so-called middle-income trap is a welfare trap.
Now, how do you understand this trap?
The welfare trap.
Welfare trap.
Yeah, and such like the overprotection of workers. The government has promised too much about welfare to the general public. That argument has a lot of followers in China.
Yeah.
So we would like to understand your perception about it. Is welfare trap the real problem for?
No.
Okay. No. And then I would like to further to hear your further elaboration. What the real problem is?
Yes. So it's just not true. In this period of what you could call national consumerism, consumerist developmentalism of this recent historical period, the governments of Lula and Dilma developed these conditional cash transfer programs. Numerically, they're very, very modest. No one can really live on them. They prevent people from dying of hunger if they don't have employment. But in no sense are they what the Brazilian people want. And quantitatively, as a mechanism of redistribution, they're minuscule in comparison to the benefits that the state has given to the moneyed classes. So the Brazilian state, over a long historical period, has assured the creditors of the state within Brazil, which are 10,000 families, an astronomically high real rate of interest. So everyone who fails as a producer can continue to prosper as a rentier. For every $10 of spending in that subsidy to the moneyed classes, there's $1 of subsidy to the poor. It's inconsequential. So the idea that you're describing is this, it's the neoliberal polemic against the state. And empirically, it's entirely false. It doesn't describe the real situation. The real situation is that what the Brazilian people really want is opportunity, capability, instruments to be able to act. If they are unable to act, they accept a subsidy, state support, in this very modest form as the lesser evil. But that's not what they want. The most important social agent in the country now is this entrepreneurial petty bourgeoisie, which comes from below, which has formed hundreds of thousands of small businesses with no access to anything. No credit, no technology, nothing. Behind them is a mass of poor workers who remain poor, but who have already assimilated a culture of self-help and initiative. And they think of this entrepreneurial petty bourgeoisie as the social vanguard that they want to follow. That's the real social situation in the country. That's the real story. It's not the story that the state is distributing handouts to the poor and discouraging the poor from working and so forth. That's a preposterous description of the real social situation, which is it's an extension of the debates in the United States and in Germany about the welfare state to the radically different conditions of our society. It's the export of the neoliberal discourse to a circumstance in which it is simply absurd. That's how I would answer you.
我简单分析一下，他就是说，刚才世吉问他就是关于基本中等收入陷阱，他说中国有不少人认为，比如巴西这个中等收入陷阱是不是因为是一种福利陷阱？就 Unger 说他认为他不同意这种福利陷阱，他认为在卢拉和罗塞夫政府里面，他确实给穷人有一个最低限度的福利，就是让他们不至于饿死，就反饥饿的这样一个。但是这个实际上是远这个数量，如果和对所谓他说有钱人的补贴，就是比如说政府的那个补贴，微不足，就是政府对有钱人的补贴要远远大于这个政府对穷人的补贴。所以但这些穷人实际上就是说，实际上他们真正要的是一种机会和能力的发展。但如果没有这种机会和能力，他当然就是不至于饿死的钱，他当然也会接受。但是呢，这个不是他们真正想要的，他们真正想要的是一种，就类似于一种小资产阶级的愿望，一个小的 business 什么，那么这个就是，但是就是这个是他们真正的就是挑战，是给这个广大的这种中小企业，甚至就有这种很多工人阶级，他实际上有一个成为独立的小资产阶级的愿望，但是不是他认为不应该是传统的小资产阶级，应该是一种新型的小资产阶级，他的意思。
So the real sin of these governments is not that they democratize demand, it's that they fail to democratize supply.
他说他们这些政府的根本的问题就是他们真正的错误或者sin，就是并不是说他们使需求侧民主化，关键是他们没有做到使供给侧民主化。
Thank you very much for your clarification. Actually, I didn't buy the logic, saying that the middle-income trap in South African countries are really welfare trap. If you look at the level of inequality, they give you the coefficients, and Brazil is among the highest. So should the government have that social policies to help the poor? How could that be? So logically, things, but unfortunately, I have to say that the argument, the branding Brazil as a failure because of this welfare trap. I mean, that kind of argument had a lot of followers in China. Of course, they're not real experts on Brazil.
Well, and that's an expression of the circumstance in which there's no deep intellectual engagement
That's
between us.
yeah, very unfortunate.
And that's really what I think is the practical agenda. We have all these ships bringing manufactured goods now to Brazil, to a deindustrialized Brazil from China, taking our soy and iron ore back to China. But there are no ships bringing and taking ideas. And so that's really what brings me here, to see how we could begin to work on these things.
I agree with that.
刚才世吉就说，这并不是世吉的观点，但是他说中国有很多人相信巴西的问题就是福利陷阱，所以 Unger 就是说
民粹主义。
对香港，所以他就认为这就说明中巴的交流思想交流太少了，就没有一个就是思想的那个传，所以这是他的愿意来的原因。今天，
我刚才非常同意那个。您关于就是说，要是改革全球的这个治理架构，首先呢，国内要做好这种制度性的安排和准备，这个是我非常同意的。而且我觉得您08年提出来的这个关于发展中国家怎么来改变全球治理架构，这个想法还是很前沿的。但是我想问的一点就是说，一个是在制度内改，一个是在不管是在制度内改也好，还是说另起炉灶也好，您觉得现在这个就是金砖国家这个引领来改变国际规则，这个时代是不是真正的来了？然后还有一个问题呢，就是说在美国这种从多边相对退出的这种情况下。如果失去他的这种主动推动的这种意愿，仅靠发展中国家的这种推动，是不是能够真正达到我们改变这个规则的这个目的呢？其他人不
No. So again, just to reiterate what I suggested before, it wouldn't work simply to repeat the kinds of proposals that I made 10 years ago.
Sure.
Because the antecedent work of reorienting our development strategies has not been done. And as you recognized, we need to have these strong internal projects in order to be able to have a strong external project. The external project is simply an expression of the internal project. But there isn't any simple linear sequence. That is, once we begin to form conceptually and practically the internal project, we can immediately begin the work of formulating this revisionary strategy through the BRICS movement and through other vehicles for the world order. So one thing follows immediately on the other. But the first step is the formation of the strong internal project.
非常感谢，今天晚上有很多问题，他问题没有问，就是他的问题没有反。我想问一个问题，就是供给侧民主化是个非常好的概念，非常好的概念，对我们启发也很大。我就想问一下，这种提法在巴西现在的这个决策影响，就是或者说这个主流的这些思想界有没有一定共识？如果有的话，下一步如果巴西要搞这个供给侧民主化就是如果是2018年上来的政府，他们会从哪些地方入手？他们的优先项是什么？
不好意思，我插一句啊，我因为有会，所以我要走。吕刚，你一会儿把我的问题再帮我再问一遍。我非常抱歉，我因为还有一个课题讨论。
实际上他就是刚才他就是一个回答，他觉得刚才那个就是但是比较隐晦的一个回答。
OK。
他就是还是就是他说是不是金砖能不能现在能不能真正起到改变国际作用，还是取决于金砖五国内部能不能有这个新的。
OK。我就非常感谢他的那个，因为我们在做全球治理的研究，所以以后可能还有问题请教啊，表达一下。
Yeah. So the general situation in Brazil intellectually with respect to these issues isn't different from what it is generally in the world. The general situation in the world is that the progressives, the leftists, have a project for the demand side of the economy and have no project for the supply side of the economy. They abandon the supply side to the right. That's the general situation. And the agenda of an inclusive form of the knowledge economy is, among other things, an attempt to give content, institutional content, to the idea of transformation of the supply side in a progressive or left direction. So, I should be explicit about my position. I'm a leftist and I'm a nationalist. And so everything that I say is from that standpoint.
Questions though. What's the current status of supply side democratization in Brazil?
No, I'm saying there isn't this idea. So we have we recognize now that we have to work on the supply side, just like the Chinese leadership. I read in the newspapers what they said. They will transform the economy on the supply side.
Yeah.
The Brazilians are saying it's the same thing, with the same relative vacuity. And that is, the same level of abstraction, the same absence of content. So I regard these abstractions as a rhetorical and practical political opportunity. So they provided the abstractions, now let's provide the content. That's the spirit.
I don't know whether it's true. I mean, for China, this supply side structural transformation has real policy implications.
No, it has real policy implications everywhere, but the policy implications up to now have been within a very narrow range of institutional transformation. And so one of the things that I'm arguing is that we can connect the abstract discourse of transformation on the supply side to an audacious institutional program, which is this program of developing an inclusive vanguardism. And it's one of the bases that I propose for the beginning of a discussion between us.
所以问题是关于供给侧的民主化这个概念，在巴西影响怎么样？他说，实际上也和中国差不多，这个概念是有，但是实际上它的内容，就是实际上还是比较属于一种真空的状态。那么他们在全世界范围内，左翼和进步 （left and progressive） 的力量，实际上以前都集中在需求侧，但是左翼实际上没有在供给侧接续两会提出真正有价值的方案。他认为中国和巴西虽然有这个词，他觉得很好，是一个很好的机会，对，但是我们希望把这个供给侧结构性改革的那个制度创新的内容给弄出来，就是。
他实际上这部分讲的是全球治理和国家治理的这个关系。那正好高所长负责一个国家治理的一个基础课题，我是负责这个全球治理的这个基础课题，所以是我们两个这个研究这个关系是。那么我想问他一个什么问题呢？就是如何来看待这个罗德里克提出的关于这个全球化的这个三元悖论啊，就是全球化、民主化和国家主权，这三者之间只能是吧？三者取其二啊。这三者取其二呢，现在很有意思。欧洲呢是这个坚持这个全球化和民主化，所以他就让渡一部分国家主权，是吧？美国呢实际上是要坚持民主化， 坚持国家主权，所以他在全球化，特朗普就带着往回走，是吧？往后退。那么中国呢，实际上是也坚持国家主权，要坚持引领这个全球化。那么民主化上是不是就要放慢一点儿，是吧？这是我主要想问他们怎么看这个事情。再一个呢，就是巴西是什么选择？在这三者之间，他要的是什么？不要的，他的取舍是吧？是什么？然后这个一个是巴西的选择是什么？还有一个呢，就是这个三元悖论能不能破解？也就是说，我能不能既坚持全球化，又坚持国家主权，然后我还要推进这个民主化？有没有这种可能？啊，因为我看他的介绍，他对巴西的民主化做了很大贡献。
和罗德很熟，他们就是一起教课。
对，
和罗德里克。
对，所以我想听听看这个。
So Danny Roderick is a friend of mine, an ally of mine, and a co-teacher of mine. I teach courses. But he radically understates the degree to which both the market economy and globalization can be transformed. They're not there on a take it or leave it basis. It's not more market and less market. It's a different kind of market. It's not more globalization or less globalization. It's a different globalization. So the whole doctrine of the trilemma supposes a reification of the present form of the market and the present form of globalization. I don't believe in this trilemma. And so I'm unwilling to situate countries in one or another position. I regard it as a mystification based on a reification, to use the canonical Marxist terms.
他是说，丹尼罗德里克实际上是他的很好的朋友，他们而且一起教课，但是在这个三元悖论上，他是不同意罗德里克，因为罗德里克就是把比如说全球化、国家和民主这三个东西，都给他的物化，他觉得也挺神秘化，他说是马克思主义的传统观念还是有意，就是因为实际上把全球化、民主和国家主权所谓物化或者神秘化，就是说把他们现有的形式当成一定是固定的或者一定是必要的，但他实际上认为全球化可以有不同的形式，比如说可以有刚才他建议的一种改革，所以全球化、国家主权和民主都可以有不同形式。我觉得他没直说，但是我的意思就是说，其实这个可以三者都达到，但这三者的内容都应该改变，我觉得是。
Could you please clarify the point when Dr. Chi interpreted your point? We asked Dr. Gauss a question. You said that the Brazil government subsidy to the poor is much less than to the rich. Is that your point? That's one question. Another question that.
No, but there was a very specific point, which is what he raised, which is whether the size of welfare spending is a discouragement to work and to initiative. The answer is that it's not.
Okay.
And one of the reasons why it's not is that it's so minimal. No one who is not sick or not incapacitated would prefer that to economic activity, if he could find economic activity.
Another question is that let's assume that the BRICS adopt your suggestion that we initiate another trading arrangement based on your institutional minimalism within the BRICS. How would the trading situation between the China and Brazil will change, do you think? If we adopt this kind of institutional minimalism within the BRICS, countries we adopt,
The question of minimalism and maximalism does not typically arise in bilateral trade treaties. It arises either in the global trade treaties or in the large multi-party regional trade tax. Because the WTO is being weakened, and now the main action in the world trading regime is in these large regimes, like the transatlantic proposal or the trans-Pacific proposal. So what it means practically is we don't make the cause of economic opening depend on the acceptance of a restraint on internal institutional experimentation. Because if we make economic openness depend on a restraint on internal experimentation, all the friends of internal experimentation will be required to become enemies of economic openness.
我需要翻译一下啊，对，他的回答就是说，就是您的这个问题大概就是说，如果在 BRICS 这个金砖5国之内采用了他的那个所谓制度最小主义的话，会怎么样？那么他说呢？他说他这个制度最小主义是指的多边的，比如说 WTO 或者像 TPP 或者美国和欧洲这个谈判的叫什么 TTIP 这种是一种比较大的多边。说 WTO 整个现在相对衰落的作用，但是还比较大的多边，所以他说他觉得 BRIC 这个之内的那个就是好像他觉得不是那什么，对吧？然后他就主要就还是说，关键是说你就是怎么在国内的创新的空间的余地，如果你把那个多边的里边搞得太约束条件太紧。
So you know, it's a central current, and I'll be very explicit and not diplomatic at all. We can't create alternatives without ideas, so we need a doctrine. And what alarms me in these conversations is the sense of the absence, not only the sense of the absence of a doctrine, but the sense of the presence of the wrong doctrine. So 3 people here at this table mentioned Danny Roderick's trilemma of globalization, suggesting that they believe in it, but it's false. And it's part of a way of thinking that is false. And so we're not going to be able to work on these alternatives unless we develop our doctrine. And the first order of business before us is doctrinal formulation.
他特别好玩，他说他就不怎么讲客气，不是外交辞令，他就说他真实感觉就是说，他认为最核心的还是就是新的原则的思想的这个最重要。但他说今天我们讨论当中有3个人都提出了，就是说，在罗德里克的那个3元悖论，他觉得这个就是使他觉得就是说，实际上人们还是虽然他和罗德里克是很好的朋友，但这点他就说反映一种思维方式，就认为就是民主市场。全球化都有一种唯一的形式，恰恰这种思维方式是他发现的。他就说民主市场国家主权都可以用不同的制度表现，而且就是他不认为一个概念就直接对应一种制度，这是他的最核心的思想。那么他就在这个情况下，就是他就这个讨论，就是这种 doctrinal 这种原则性的讨论，他觉得其实是最重要的。
I have a comment and also a question. You mentioned Brazil's.
I think better turn on the microphone.
I really appreciate your point that China's trade relations with Brazil is not the cause of Brazil's problem, but the expression of it.